Okay, welcome to this meeting in our Forum for Conscious Research. My name is Johan Storm, and I'm leading this forum, and it's a great pleasure for me to welcome Claire Sargent from Paris, University of Paris. Claire is really an outstanding researcher in this field, and her recent work is highly relevant for much of the ongoing debate in the field at the moment, including the disagreement about whether consciousness, the front or the back of the brain is most important for consciousness. We'll come back to that later. Since I heard her talk about this in Amsterdam 2 years ago, in December 2022, you've been on top of my list for people I would like to invite to Oslo to talk. So I'm very happy to have you here. But before starting, I just want to remind the audience about the basics, how we define consciousness in our field. So she said consciousness is simply any kind of experience like seeing, hearing, feeling, and thinking, etc. And this remains an unsolved mystery for science. So that is clear. So Claire is currently a professor in cognitive neuroscience at the Paris Cité University. She first studied biology at the École Normale Supérieure and became interested in cognitive neuroscience during an internship at the University College in London. After a master in cognitive science, she completed a PhD on conscious vision with one of the leading pioneers in this field, Stanislas Dehaene in Paris. So she finished her PhD in 2005. She was then a postdoc at the University College in about 2 years, before joining Catherine Talon-Baudry's and Lionel Nakache labs at Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris. And in 2012, she became an assistant professor with the chair of excellence at the Paris Cité University. Now, since 2020, she is a full professor in this place and in the Integrative Neuroscience and Cognition Center. And 2 years ago, she was awarded the prestigious ERC Consolidated Grant for a conscious brain project. So Claire's main research interest is the understanding of mechanisms of conscious access, notably in vision and audition and in healthy human adults, but also in patients with disorders of consciousness. And for this, she is using a variety of the methods in experimental psychology and electrophysiology, like EEG, MEG, and intracranial recordings, and functional MRI. So Claire belongs to a particularly strong tradition of consciousness research in Paris that was founded by the pioneers Jean-Pierre Changeux and Stanislas Dehaene around the turn of the millennium. And then declared that understanding consciousness has now become the ultimate intellectual challenge of this new millennium. And from 1998, they, inspired by a psychologist theory by Bernard Bars, Dehaene and Changeux launched what has now become one of the leading theories in the field, the global neuron workspace theory. And the main point there is that when sensory stimulus become conscious, that happens only when the stimulus is significant and strong enough to be broadcast through the whole or most part of the cortex, what's called ignition. So we'll hear more about that later. So, but right from the early beginning, Claire was heavily involved in developing this leading theory, as shown by this early paper from 2003, 2004, and 2005. And already in 2004, she wrote about this all and on bifurcation phenomenon that she'll probably talk more about and that she has developed since. Among our more recent studies, I will particularly highlight this one from 2001, where she developed this bifurcation analysis to make extremely important discoveries that we'll hopefully also hear more about in her talk. As some of you may have known, some of you know that there was a very heated debate last year about theories of consciousness after a highly high-profile adversarial collaboration project to test and compare predictions from the various theories. And the first results were presented at the public meeting in New York City last June. It was a big event, I remember it, I was there, but a main difference between these theories that the global neuron workspace theory has for a long time claimed that activity in the prefrontal cortex is essential for consciousness, whereas a rival theory, the integrated information theory, has claimed that it's sufficient to have activity in the back of the brain, and that's the main thing. And this is the paper from the collaboration where they compared these theories and their predictions that came out last year. And but as far as I can see, Claire's work is not mentioned among the references there. So that is, although it seems to be highly relevant. By the way, Lucia Meloni, who is a leader of this consortium, she will come here in September and talk about this adversarial collaboration where they compare theories. In February this year, we published this paper. It's coming out on paper in May, where we try to compare different theories, and we think that these are actually more similar than is usually thought. So, and they may be reconciled to some extent. And also here, Claire's work is extremely relevant, although in this paper we had a space problem, so we didn't, it's only shortly mentioned, but I'm now working on something to highlight that importance more in the follow-up publication. For those of you, finally, for those of you who are not familiar with our forum from before, I would like to encourage you to visit our website. These are some of the previous speakers in this forum. And we also have a Facebook web page. And we'll also mention that the next meeting is in just about a month, May 15, when Jana Ru will talk about the science of consciousness in the age of artificial intelligence. That will be at the Blindern campus. And after Claire's lecture, there will be a session with a question and a discussion. So we'll bring about around the microphone. And with that, I would like to leave the floor to you, Claire. And we are looking very much forward to your talk.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, well, hello everyone. Thank you very much for your invitation and the amazing introduction. A bit impressive, actually. So, hi everyone. Today I'm just checking the time. Okay. So. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to give you an overview of my work, where we try to investigate the neural mechanisms of processing in humans. Before I delve into this work, I'd like to highlight the fact that it's, as every research work, a very collaborative work, and highlight my current team, former teams, and many collaborators that contributed to this work. Okay, so we've already had a little bit of a primer about consciousness research. It's obviously a fascinating topic, but as with other concepts in psychology, what we're trying to do is to try to see what's behind this intuition that we take with this word of human language, which is consciousness. What's this intuition we spontaneously have about our own workings? What's behind that? Is it homogeneous, or are there different topics, etc.? On the face of it, it seems that we can distinguish different elements and different topics covered by this word, and indeed, different labs in the world are addressing different questions that are related to this spontaneous term. So obviously, we might be interested in conscious states, so anesthesia versus sleep versus being awakened, etc. Some might be interested in self-consciousness. How do you construct a self, etc. So within this landscape, and they might be connected, obviously, but we have to address each first. We have to choose one topic in this, and I'm, of course, chose the central one. So I've been interested for many years now into addressing the question of conscious access, which is simply becoming conscious of a specific content, sensation, thought, memory, etc. What happens when we become conscious of a specific content? Okay, it might be interesting to know that, to also highlight what happens during conscious states, etc. Okay, so how do we address this question? We address this question, one of the entrance points to addressing this question is these kind of phenomena. So I don't know if we need to dim the light. Otherwise, do you think it's possible? Otherwise, it might work. So I'm going to play this. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to play this, and you will see at the center of the screen a little green dot that is going to blink. I'll ask you to fixate this dot, and that's all. So let's give it a try like this. So I don't know if it's working for you, but at some point, when you're fixating this dot, you might see one or several of the yellow dots disappear. Can you see that? Yes? Yes? Okay, I'll play it again. Okay, so I hope it's working for some of you.
Sorry.
Yeah.
He couldn't do it from there. There should be a person.
Okay, that's fine.
It's okay, it works fine.
Okay. Okay, and otherwise you can look it up in YouTube, motion-induced blindness. Okay, so okay, you have to trust me, those who didn't experience it. But what happens is at some point, one or several of the dots disappear. But what's interesting is that they don't disappear from the screen, they disappear from your conscious experience. Okay, so that highlights a first observation that's an entry point to studying conscious access, which is it's not because a visual or perceptual information is getting into your brain, like retina and probably into your brain, that you're conscious of it, even when you're awake. There's a difference between processing an information, even when we're awake, and being conscious of it, having access to this information. So the question becomes clear, at least at the start. What's the difference in my brain when I see the dot and when I don't see it? Okay? And that's the contrast I've been trying to make all of my career now. And I'm going to talk to you about that. So one of our early studies, we tried to make this contrast with another type of protocol, which is the attentional blink, and which allows to present a word on the screen in such a way that sometimes for the same external stimulation, you will tell me, oh yeah, I've seen it quite well, and sometimes you'll tell me, no, I haven't seen anything. There was no word in the list. Just like with the dot, okay? So that's an ideal situation where the simulation in the external world is the same, but the subjective report is different. And what we did is record EEG, so brain activity of our participants between the moment where we present the stimulus and the moment where they tell us what they feel, and sort the trials according to what they were saying, I've seen it or not. And here is what we observed. So I don't know, probably not everyone is familiar with this representation. So these are EEG voltages. So you imagine that the nose is pointing up like this, and you have all the electrodes spread out. That would be the back of the brain, and the colors reflect the voltages of the electrodes. And what we see here is quite intriguing, because the first 200 milliseconds of processing, so the first waveforms of sensory processing, are strictly identical, whether people at the end tell us that they've seen the stimulus or not. And then we saw a very clear divergence moment around 250 milliseconds, so a quarter of a second, where these two types of trials followed very different paths, neural paths. And trials where people said that they have seen the stimulus showed different waveforms up to half a second after the presentation of the stimulus. So it seemed like almost an all or none event. Either you enter a mode of processing that will lead you to say that you've seen the stimulus, or you enter another mode. And that was quite clear-cut. So what's interesting is that we can reconstruct the sources in the brain of these activations, and we can have the film of what's going on in our participants' brain according to whether they've seen the stimulus or not. So seen is below, not seen is above, and you see the left hemisphere, right hemisphere, and this is the brain from below, okay? So I'll start the film. You have a little timer here relative to the moment where we presented the stimulus. And you see that the first activations are visual activations in the occipital cortex, and they are identical in both cases, and they develop in the temporal cortex. That's exactly what we expect, but around 250 milliseconds, we have a sharp difference, and here it seems to correspond to the moment where frontal areas kick in, or other areas than the traditional visual areas kick in. And you have all these areas getting interested in processing the information, some reactivation of visual areas on trials where people say that they've seen the stimulus, but it's not happening at all when they say that they haven't seen the stimulus. So that was quite clear-cut result. It seemed like this sequence here, this sequence of neural activity corresponded to what we experience as seeing or perceiving consciously. And here is the interpretation we gave of these results in the framework of what you presented earlier, which is the global workspace theory that was initially introduced by Bars and then developed by Dehaene and Changeux, and then taken up by lots of collaborators of Dehaene and Changeux. So what we interpret here is that this initial sensory processing might be pre-conscious. It might lead the way to the two possible outcomes, being conscious of the stimulus or not. But what it takes for you to become conscious would be the fact that you share this information that was built up in the sensory cortices, you share it much more broadly to cognitive areas that would allow you to make something more flexible of this information. And that's the idea of global sharing, which is central in the global workspace theory. And we thought that, this point we've seen where we see the divergence, we thought that this might correspond to the entry point towards this other this particular equilibrium in processing, and it might correspond to the moment where the attention gets locked into this specific representation. So a sort of selection by attention that would lead to global sharing. Okay? And we often also use another type of representation of this global workspace idea in the form of a graph. So that would be a graph with the dots being the different modules in the brain. And the central message of this graph is that there are some areas that are highly connected. What happens when a stimulus comes in is first, it goes through peripheral processes that are, which follow a very automatic route of processing, very efficient, but very stereotyped. But if one representation manages to gain importance at one of the hubs here, then it might be stabilized first by recurrent processing, but also it will be much more influential to the rest of the network, so that it will get an impact towards many different functional parts of the network. And that would lead this initial information to not only follow the most connected routes that are efficient but stereotyped, but can also be handled and influential, and you could make much more of it by encoding it in episodic memory, reporting it with language, having it influence current goals, etc. So that would account for the functional aspects of consciousness that we experience. Okay, so I've shown you this example, and I've shown you how clear-cut, at least in the attentional blink, the distinction between conscious and non-conscious processing was. But of course, that's not the end of the story. Because, okay, we and other people found differences that occurred only at the late phases of processing. But if you see other types of protocols, other studies, they find earlier differences, and even differences before the presentation of the stimulus in brain activity. And the reason why we find all these possible differences when we contrast conscious versus non-conscious processing is that when we do that, we take up everything that correlates with the fact of eventually becoming conscious of the stimulus or not. Even a state of the brain activity that comes before the stimulus that will lead to conscious or non-conscious processing. So I think that and I share that with the next speaker, I think. I think that we're now at a turning point where that's very exciting, because we've seen that indeed it's real. There's a real difference in the brain that correlates with conscious experience. But we now need to find, among all these neural correlates of consciousness, which ones might correspond to core mechanisms of conscious access, and which ones rather correspond to precursors, so probably sensory processes that are not yet conscious processes, and from consequences. So, for example, everything you can do if you've entered conscious experience, which is not conscious experience proper, but maybe task-related processing that might be dissociated from that. Okay, so this is really my research program now. Can we do this dissection? Can we get closer to these core mechanisms of conscious access? And I'm going to try to give you some hints of how we tackle these two problems. And let's first start with trying to dissociate core mechanisms of conscious access from consequences or executive processes. And that relates to actually interesting dialogues and current debates in the field, where some researchers highlighted the fact that so far in these studies, we've always asked people to report their experience, which makes sense. Otherwise, how could we sort out the trials? But then it means that the contrast we are making is including all these decisional processes that are necessary for answering the question. So some researchers, like my colleague Naotsugo Tsushiya, suggested that we should also go for no report protocols, where people don't report their experience, but we still contrast conscious, non-conscious. But how can we do that? So here's how we try to tackle this issue. Probably you noticed that in the initial film, there is this sharp divergence moment. So the same stimulus is producing the same sensory processing, and then suddenly there's a divergence, what we also call the bifurcation. On some trials, it's leading to several types of neural activity. On other trials, much less, okay? So we thought this kind of divergence we could observe in neural activity without even asking people to report the stimulus. So that's really the basic idea behind this study. Are bifurcation dynamics associated with conscious access, even in the absence of the task? And the idea, so yeah, I was mentioning Tsushiya for that. Another point that was very important for us is, okay, we've seen this bifurcation in a very specific protocol. So it was the attentional blink, so we used attention, it was vision, we had sharp transients in the visual stimulation. If these dynamics reflect dynamics that are typical of becoming conscious of an information, we should find it for any type of stimulus, and even with protocols that don't use attention. So that was also our incentive for having a very different protocol using audition at threshold, so very simple auditory stimuli at threshold. And the last good reason for having that was, hello? The last good reason for having that was to be able to do that with patients with disorders of consciousness. So patients that don't communicate, we can do EEG at the bedside, but it's very difficult to have visual stimuli. So auditory stimuli can be used. So the idea is also that we build a protocol that can be transferred to patients. Okay, so with that in mind, here is what we exactly did. So in this experiment, these were only healthy volunteers. In this experiment, people were listening to a continuous noise like this. And within that noise, we inserted vowels, A and E, the French ones, at 6 different levels of intensity around the auditory threshold, okay? And there were also no sound trials. And people came for 2 sessions, that the order was counterbalanced across subjects. An active session where we asked people to report what was the vowel, A or E, and how well they have heard the vowel. So that resembles what I've shown you before in the attentional blink. And they also came for a passive session in which the periods of stimulations were the same, but the sounds were irrelevant to their task, because after each period of stimulation, we had a question that was different. It was a quiz question. Who was the Queen of England in these years, etc. Okay, so the sounds were not relevant. Okay. And in order to guide our analysis of the neural data that were recorded again with EEG, we wanted to be a bit more specific and make a model, like a statistical model, of what kind of dynamics we really want to contrast, okay? And so we thought we want to contrast these two types of dynamics, unimodal dynamics and bifurcation dynamics. So unimodal dynamics, we're all very familiar with them, actually. These would relate to neural processes whose intensity gradually increase with the stimulation strength, okay? So if here it's stimulation strength, and each dot here is the neural activity I record at some point after the stimulation for these different stimulation strengths, I see that all the trials increase in activity strength with stimulation strength, okay? So it's unimodal distributions. In bifurcation dynamics, we assume that at some point, when we reach some specific level of stimulation, there will appear two types of trials. On some trials, we'll remain at baseline, and on some trials, we'll trigger another type of activity. And then we would go across this period where we have a bifurcation. Same stimulation, two types of outcome. Okay? So how can we diagnose these two types of dynamics in our brain recordings? Well, if we do what we usually do when processing brain activity, that is averaging the activity across trials, we'll just see that mean activity increases with stimulation strength, but you see that it's not very diagnostic. We don't know whether we're in unimodal or bifurcation dynamics. But there's another very simple summary statistics that we can use to see whether we have bifurcation dynamics, and that's simply looking at variability across trials. And here we have a signature of unimodal versus bifurcation dynamics. With unimodal dynamics, we predict monotonous or either a flat variability relative to stimulation strength or monotonic increase. But for bifurcation dynamics, there will be a signature of this threshold value where you have two types of trials, and that will be a burst of variability of the activity across trials. And then as you go away from the threshold where you recover a single population of trials, the variability will decrease again. So this pattern of variability with a burst at intermediate value was our first summary statistics, the first thing we wanted to look at in the data to see whether there were some neural activity that showed bifurcation. So we did that first in the active session, where people report the stimulus. But of course, that's an analysis we can do without taking care of the response of the subjects. So these are the neural activities we recorded in the active session. And here I'm going to show you these data of mean and variability for a very simple measure of the mean of the activity around these 8 electrodes here that capture the activity very well. And then we did more refined analysis. But that will do for the moment. So if we look at how this mean activity is evolving with the stimulation strength here, we see that the intensity of these activity indeed increases with stimulation strength. So here it's a negative activity, so it increases in intensity by going down. And then here it increases in intensity by going up. But we see we've seen that it's not telling us whether we're in unimodal or bifurcation dynamics. So now let's look at the variability across trials. And what we observe up to 300 milliseconds after the presentation of the stimulus is what we expect in unimodal dynamics. So apparently, activity is following the stimulation strength, and that's it. But what was very striking, and came straight away, was that in the late period, we had this typical pattern of burst of variability around threshold stimulation for the brain activity that come after 400 milliseconds. So that was a first indication that for this second period in neural activity, we had two types of trials, probably, when we stimulated at threshold. And that was what was behind the high variability at this stage. So now we can go into more details. Yes, and indeed, we also summarized the activity with more refined techniques, not just averaging activity of several electrodes, but using multivariate pattern analysis. But all you have to know is that it's a good summary of the brain activity at that moment. So as I said, now that we've found this quite clear-cut pattern in the summary statistics, we can go into more detail and look at the actual distribution of activity across trials. So these are the models. So in our model, we assume that for unimodal activity, we'll see Gaussian distributions that increase in mean with stimulation strength here. In the bifurcation model, we assume that there will be, for intermediate stimulation, bimodal distributions where there are two types of trials. And what do we observe in this late period of activity? That's indeed something that looks like this bifurcation model. So we find that in individuals and also in the group. So you do see that here, for intermediate stimulation strength, it's really not a single Gaussian. It must be a mixture of things. So probably here, we have two types of trials. And these two types of trials, they might relate to conscious, non-conscious processing of the stimulus. And indeed, so we could, using trial-by-trial activity, we could fit our two models to this trial-by-trial activity and compare how well they do to explain our activity. And indeed, the unimodal model is winning up until 250 milliseconds, and then it's the other model that wins. Okay, so of course, our idea was that these two types of processing might relate to two different experiences, as we've seen in the attentional blink video. So we used the activity we recorded trial by trial and the fit we had with our model to put a bet on whether people were conscious of the stimulus or not during that trial. So could we predict the audibility response based on neural activity alone? So that's what is new and interesting, is that we don't inject any priors about the form of the activity or any prior about what people reported on that trial. We just observe some waveforms that split, and we assume that the trials where the late activity is not triggered might be non-conscious and the others might be conscious, and we see whether our bet is true. And this is the result of this prediction or bet. And indeed, at different points after the presentation of the stimulus, and indeed, we perform quite well in predicting whether people will say that they've heard the stimulus or not. Okay, so it seems to relate to conscious experience. Okay, so next thing is, do we have the same pattern when people don't make a task on the stimulus? So that was our key question at the, originally. But we've already made an interesting journey because we've seen that this split bifurcation is generalized to audition at threshold. But does it generalize to a situation where you're not making any task on the stimulus? Well, and that was a very honest question for me. That was my initial bet when we put on this experiment. I remember discussing that with my student. I said, okay, so we're going to have this late positive activity. Technically, it's a P300. And if it only relates to decision making, it's just related to the task, it should disappear in the passive session because people are not making a task on the stimulus. But if this late activity relates to becoming conscious of the stimulus, it should remain in the trials where the stimulus is strong enough. So in a situation where you would become conscious of the sound even if you don't have to make a task on it, okay? So that was the bet. Either it remains, maybe less intensity, or it's not there. And what's really cool is that neither was true. And I think it's always when you discover something that you had not anticipated that you learn most, obviously. So here we were quite surprised to see that there were very late activations. So people don't have to make anything on the stimulus. They're still processing it up to more than half a second after the presentation of the stimulus, which we found quite striking. But even with the eyes of faith, this is absolutely not a P300. This is not the topography that we observe in the active condition. So it means that the network behind that is different. And we thought probably the network that is behind these electrical activity here might be core conscious access. And what happens here is both core conscious access plus connecting it to executive processes. We can indeed show with some specific analysis that these waveforms are included in these ones, but it's more intuitive to look at the source reconstruction on the brain. So here, it's a reconstruction of the brain sources observed in the late period when people have to make a task on the stimulus. So you see nice auditory activations, but also frontal, parietal activations, temporal activations. And what happens at the same period when people are not making a task on the stimulus? So you see that the pattern is different, and indeed, the topography was different. You still have activations in the temporal cortex. You also have, you seem to have, so it's only EG source reconstruction, seem to have activations in the frontal, in other areas. So you still seem to have a network of areas that are implicated, but it's different from what we observe in the active. And what was very striking, I think, was that the difference between the two was very clear-cut. And it seemed to relate to executive areas, so almost motor preparation, different levels of abstractions into preparing a motor response, okay? So it makes a lot of sense. And so that's what we'd like to suggest now, that if what we observe when people are becoming conscious of a stimulus and doing a task on the stimulus is a global workspace, maybe what happens when they spontaneously become conscious of the stimulus is a sort of global playground, so a situation where the information is still shared among different processes in the brain and circulated, but for no particular purpose. And that the equation between these two would be either to connect this sharing moment with task-related network or not, depending on whether you have to make a task on the stimulus or not. So that's the proposition we'd like to work on now. One step in that is to perform the same experiment with fMRI, so that we have the networks, the two global workspace and global playground networks. Because here, again, it's not very reliable, although it seems to make sense. It's not very reliable because it's only source reconstruction from EEG. Okay, back to the EEG we observed in the passive listening session. Is this late activity here that we claim might be related to spontaneous conscious access? Is it showing these bifurcation dynamics as well? And yes, it seems to be the case based on our indicator, which is the variability across trials. But that's when reviewer 2 told us, okay, you have a nice story, you're saying that these late activity here are spontaneous conscious access, but what's your benchmark? How can you be sure that when this late activity occurs, people are experiencing the sound? Okay, of course, that's the catch-22 of these no-report paradigms, okay? But what's nice is that we had been working with different colleagues on this protocol, and including a colleague, Jérôme Sacure, who advised us on putting some mind-wandering probes during the passive session. So what is a mind-wandering probe? It's just that you're doing, you're in this condition where you're passively listening to the sound, but from time to time I ask you, what's in your mind, okay? And sometimes I ask you, what's in your mind? And you tell me, I had the sound, I had the E or A in my mind, because you happen to spontaneously be conscious of the stimulus. It's only a small part of the trials, obviously, because we wanted it to be passive. But we could still try to see whether we could predict, based on the presence or absence of this late activity, whether on mind-wandering trials, people will say, oh, I had the sound in my mind versus something else, okay? So that's exactly this prediction of mind-wandering content based on this neural activity. And indeed, we could predict this mind-wandering. It's not as strong as we observed in the active session, but it's only a smaller portion of the trials. So that was very, I would say, very, very encouraging, because it suggested that these bifurcation dynamics might be a hallmark of conscious processing in the brain, whether or not a task is involved, and with minimal priors on what form it should have. Okay, maybe we just have to look at neural processes that have this abrupt and bifurcation dynamics, and they might relate to conscious experience because the neural activity that leads to conscious experience might have these loops that makes it either happen or not. And that could be very promising for probing conscious processing in non-communicating patients, because then we could look at whether a patient has, when we present different stimulus intensity, whether we find an intensity where we have these two types of trials and detect whether some subjects are conscious or not, or if our hypothesis is correct. So that's what we've started to do with Martina Corazzol in my team. Okay, I don't know. So I'm over the time. No?
No, you can continue for, I spent 10 minutes, so you can continue.
Okay. So now there's a bifurcation. Either I show you the intracranial recordings on these type of studies, or I'll tell you about retroperception. Or I try to be quick. Okay, so maybe I'll try that. Okay, so let's do that. So this is preliminary results with intracranial recordings in human adults. So a participant that have epilepsy, so they have intracranial recordings for clinical purpose, but we can also perform some research in these participants. What we did was to record brain activity in different regions of the brain with the same protocol, so different levels of stimulation. And to summarize the data from all these different electrodes, different patients, we first made a clustering analysis, which allows us to identify groups of electrodes that behave the same way with the stimuli. And we found that the data were well summarized by 4 clusters. Cluster 1 is this one. So these are essentially auditory electrodes, a little one here in the frontal, and they respond really fast, 100 or less milliseconds after the stimulation. And the strength of the activity scales with the strength of the stimulation in both the active and passive. They respond to both. A second cluster, auditory electrodes, but also frontal electrodes. This time, it responds later. You see, around 250 milliseconds. It scales with stimulation strength, and it responds with less intensity in the passive condition. And then the last one is really close to motor cortex, and it's only there in the active condition, not in the passive. And the 4 cluster seems to be very heterogeneous. Okay, so it seems to us that there seems to be a sensory, a central, and then motor component. Yes?
And also when it comes to visual stimuli, you can even in the early visual area see a late wave that comes back from the front, right?
Yes.
You don't see that in the other time.
So here with this broadband gamma activity, we see that it remains late, but we don't see the 2 peaks. But in other experiments and with other measures, we do see the 2 peaks. So one feed forward and then back.
Also in auditory areas.
For this one, I would need to go back to the event-related potentials. I think we do see that in the event-related potentials. But with the broadband, we seem to have something, yeah. And also it's the cluster summary. So if we go back to exactly Eschel's gyrus, maybe we have the 2 bumps. But it's just a coarse vision of what we have here. And what's interesting is to distinguish conscious versus non-conscious trials in these different clusters. So conscious versus non-conscious in the active sessions, or mind-wandering probes with sound versus something else for the passive sessions. And what we observe is that both in the active and passive, there is no difference in the sensory areas, no difference between heard and not heard. So it's not sensitive to that. But quite nicely, for this network, which is both auditory and frontal, we have a clear distinction between heard and not heard trials, both in the active and the passive. And we have other data showing responsive frontal electrodes for in the passive conditions as well. And the last cluster really seemed to be related to motor planning. So you're planning a motor response only when you've heard the stimulus in the active condition. Okay, so I think that with these, it's time for updating the previous versions of the global workspace that were very much focused on executive functions. So this is, we're actually working on it, an attempt to put the different known resting state networks that we know now on the classical graph view of the global workspace. And I think that so far, we've mainly worked on this sensory motor axis where sensory information gets mediated by attention and control areas to output a motor plan. But there are many other outputs from this global broadcasting that can happen and connect notably what we call the default mode network, which is actually a network of areas that seem to be more related to high-level models of the world and goals. So it would still make sense, and I think the central idea of global broadcasting, which comes back also to Dennett's proposition of fame in the brain, still has something to tell us about what it is to be conscious, but we need to open up the field of what we consider a cognitive function and what we consider global broadcasting is doing in terms of functional consequences. So how much time do I have now?
You have
1 minute?
10 minutes or more.
Okay, so I'll just, because we're all exhausted, I'll just briefly tell you about what we're doing about the other side of the dissection. How can we distinguish what belongs to precursor sensory processing and what belongs to actually the actual core mechanisms of conscious access? If we want to keep it simple, in this topic, you can distinguish two broad hypotheses. One would be that we become conscious of the stimulus as soon as we have local recurrent loops within sensory areas. And so becoming conscious is one part of the construction of the perceptual representation. The global workspace view and other views would consider that, no, you become conscious of a stimulus after the construction of the representation in sensory areas. You need to connect these local representations to other areas, okay? So how can we distinguish these two propositions? Well, we thought that the second hypothesis actually makes a very counterintuitive prediction that we never saw tested in the literature, which is that if that's true, we should be able to desynchronize the moment where we become conscious of the stimulus from the moment where we build the representation in our brain, okay? More precisely, we thought that we could find situations where a stimulus comes in, there is pre-conscious activity, but because the stimulus is not strong enough or you're busy with something else, you fail to perceive it consciously. But then we bet, if this hypothesis is correct, we bet that with using retrospective attention, so reactivating representations the traces of these representations that were built at this stage, we could make people conscious of this past stimulus. So trigger retrospective conscious perception of something that you should not have seen or should not have heard. Okay. So we tried that. We tried that with experimental psychology. And we did a small modification from the Posner queuing paradigm, if you know this paradigm. So it was a very exciting experiment where you had to stare at a dot in the middle of the screen for ages and try to detect small Gabor patches on the left or on the right. Okay. Well, not so exciting, actually, but it was exciting for us. Okay, so, and these targets were at threshold, so very hard to see. And the contrast was always the same for each subject and at their threshold, so they saw it half of the time, okay? And we used attention in this setting. We attracted people's attention either to the target side or to the other side by a brief dimming of one of the circles here. And importantly, we did this either before the target or after the target. So that's the manipulation I was mentioning before, okay? So doing this before the target is a classic in the attentional literature, and we observed the classical results. So this is the time, and the gray area is the moment where the target is on screen. So that's when the cue comes before the target, and we see that when the cue is on the valid side, on the side of the target, just before the target, people are much better at reporting the target because their attention was there at the right moment, and they are much better at reporting the target. In contrast to trials where we attract their attention to the other side, where they are much worse, okay? If you look at textbooks on the effect of attention on perception, they often assume that after the stimulus, you don't have any effect at all, because perception is done. The stimulus has been presented, so perception is definitive after the stimulus. But that's only an assumption. But if you actually test it, as we did, you observe that no, perception is not finished after the stimulus has been removed from the screen, because even 400 milliseconds after the disappearance of the stimulus, if you attract people's attention to the location, the previous location of the stimulus, you still improve perceptual report of the stimulus. So that was a first validation of our proposition. Maybe when the representation of the stimulus is lingering, we can still improve your perception of the stimulus after the stimulus has disappeared from the external world. And from that point, we just started playing around with that like crazy. We tested it, different dimensions of reporting the stimulus, improvement of orientation discrimination, detection D prime, subjective visibility, increase in the number of scene trials. I'm not going to detail all that, but we made replications and generalizations to audition and cross-modal situations. So it seems to be the case that when you have a stimulus that is at threshold, attention can still have a strong effect on your perception of the stimulus. So the last thing I wanted to show you is preliminary results on these kind of stimuli with the magnetoencephalography. And here we're going to see the two bumps in the visual cortex. What we did is a protocol that is similar to this one, but we used auditory cues. So we told people, for example, high-pitch cue means the target was on the left, low-pitch cue was the target was on the right. We wanted to do that because we wanted that to be sure that the cue's effect on the visual cortex is only top-down. It's not the cue that is processed by the visual cortex. It's attentional effect that we see, okay? But otherwise, it's the same principle. And I'm just going to zoom into the activity recorded in V1, reconstructed from MEG. Let's first look at the control situation where the cue comes before the target. And we see that our auditory cue already has an effect on the visual cortex. It makes sense. It has an attentional boost to the visual cortex. And then when the target comes in, we split the trials according to the subject's report. And we see these two bumps you were mentioning before. So one bump around 200 milliseconds that we think might relate to local loops. And another bump around 500 milliseconds that might indicate communication at a wider scale, so influence from higher level areas. And we observe that indeed these two bumps vary, whether you've seen the stimulus or not, and especially this second one, which seems to make a big difference between seeing the stimulus or not. Okay, so what we wanted to test when we have a cue that comes after the target is first whether we're able to trigger new bumps of activity in the visual cortex with a cue, an auditory cue that comes after, and whether we can find trials where it's the cue that made you see the stimulus, not the target. Okay, so let's first look at the recording of the visual activity for the situation where the target comes before the cue, and you see we've put the cue at 750 milliseconds. So after the classical bump triggered by the target that relates to consciousness, okay? So after that moment, not even modulating that moment. And the first observation we make is that indeed the cue is triggering new bumps, okay? We can show that with various delay between target and cue. But here you see that probably we might have a mixture of trials. We might have trials where you would have seen the stimulus anyway, and the cue is just reactivating something that was conscious anyway, okay? But our assumption is that there are also trials where this second bump didn't occur. You were not initially conscious of the stimulus, and it's only the fact that the cue triggered these late activity that allowed you to become conscious of the stimulus. So can we sort out the trials so that we find these retroperception trials? Okay, we thought, okay, if there are trials where 2T did not happen, and it's only 2C that allowed you to become conscious of the stimulus, then if we sort the trials according to whether this bump is higher than this one, we might find them out. So we just sort the trials according to whether it's the target-triggered activity that's stronger or the cue-triggered activity that's stronger. Not very surprisingly, when it's the target-triggered activity that's stronger, we still find some modulation due to the cue, but the decision was made before. The activity 2T occurred, so these are probably trials where people were spontaneously conscious of the stimulus, and then the cue reactivated that. If we make the other thing, will we just have a smaller 2T bump, or will we actually sort out trials where people shouldn't have seen the stimulus? Well, it's the second option. Indeed, just sorting out trials where the cue-triggered activity is stronger will highlight trials where the activity between the target and the cue is not significantly different between seen and unseen trials. So it's only the cue-triggered activity that allowed people to distinguish between seen and not seen. That triggered, presumably, conscious experience. So we might have found, indeed, situations where the activity that made people see the stimulus consciously is triggered by the experimenter a few hundred milliseconds after the stimulus. And okay, so to summarize these effects, I wanted to show you something that you might have seen in movies. It's called double take. So you see a little character that first looks at something blankly and then thinks twice and reacts, okay? You've seen that before, I'm sure. But so here, I pretend that I have a neuronal explanation for this double take. I think what happens is that you first have pre-conscious processing of the information. And this is obviously top-down influence from attention, conscious realization, and adapted behavior. Okay, so yeah, so it's time for me to summarize. So if we go back to our initial question, we would like to argue with these retroperception studies that even the late build-up activity that belongs to sensory processing is still pre-conscious, and that the core mechanisms of conscious access happen later. And we also like to argue that probably executive processes are just one part of the network that relates to becoming conscious of the information or not, but can actually overlap in time. And in both cases, we do think that there are typical dynamical events occurring when you're going into the type of equilibrium that allows you to become conscious of a stimulus, and that's an interesting tool to identify neural signatures of consciousness. And yeah, indeed, our project is to pursue these two lines of research to try and outline the neural processes associated with conscious access, with also some modeling approach, and obviously trying to aim at having operational signatures that could help us better diagnose non-communicating patients. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
For a wonderful talk. Great. So are you ready to take some questions now? We have half an hour about. So Björn will bring around the microphone, and yeah, I lost mine at the moment. I can hold it.
Yes.
Thank you very much. This was very interesting. I work with patients for whom this is highly relevant.
Okay.
I wonder, in your diagrams, you tend to show the right hemisphere, and the difference between conscious and not conscious experience seem to be around where the electrode C4 is placed. Is that by coincidence, or?
So, which one would you like to see? The maybe the attentional link one, or
the one where you show the EEG recordings, the different. Ah, there you are.
These ones?
No, a bit.
Okay,
I can't tell really where they are.
Yeah. Okay, I think. Okay. Let's go here and here. I think these ones.
Well, not really, but doesn't you could maybe say something about if there is a hemispheric difference in which part of the brain represents being conscious of a sensory stimulus.
Yes. Okay, so there would be two parts in my response. First, from the experimental data, I haven't noticed very strong hemispheric differences, but as you've seen, I've mainly used EG. So EG source reconstruction is not the most reliable to assess these things. So I think it would be interesting to go back to your question when I have the fMRI part. So from the data I've seen, I haven't noticed like very obvious hemispheric differences. But the other answer I'd like to make is that if we think about our hypothesis, then there should not be unique areas that contribute to becoming conscious, but it's rather the form of the workspace could be different depending on what you're doing. So, for example, I would bet that becoming conscious of verbal stimuli will activate the left hemisphere more, but it's not because conscious areas are more on the left. It's because the network that is relevant for this stimulus happens to have a left dominance. Other than that, there should also be some hubs that might always take part to the processing of the information. But to be honest, I don't have a strong bet on those hubs, except from studies that do graph analysis of communication that seem to suggest some of those, but that would be precuneus, so that would be rather central, hippocampus, but not necessarily lateralized, but yeah. So I think there are central hubs, and also the form of the network, so the form of the global workspace is going to be different depending on the stimulus, on what you're doing with the stimulus. We've seen that also with the global workspace and the global playground. So, so my bet would be we're not going to see a systematic dominance, but maybe you have an idea on a possible dominance of one hemisphere over the other one for... Yes, you do.
Yes.
Yes, and what's your bet then?
I would bet on the left hemisphere, and
but it's language.
No, but not
Yeah?
in the temporal. I'm sorry, I shouldn't occupy the microphone for too long. So if there are other ones,
All the questions in between, you could come back to this. And
Okay.
We will. Okay. Mm.
Friend's question. Looking at this diagram, if you look at this represents the left and right side, there's a clear, when patient says, I've seen it, it's activation on the left side. So there's the question, if the conscious report of a seeing is related to difference between verbal and non-verbal hemisphere. So the activation of the left hemisphere suggests that there is a visual report of a conscious object. And maybe they are at the same time in both hemispheres, but the left hemisphere had the advantage of a visual report.
Yes, but then if we, yeah, I agree with you that connects with one of my responses actually, that, yeah.
Very striking, the last.
This one, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I've seen
yeah,
it.
it's possible. But, okay, so I have to say that it's just a representation. What they were actually doing was using the keyboard to place a cursor on a visibility scale. So it was not Broca's area, if you want. But it was, indeed, as I've said, possibly the networks that take part to the task part of the experiment, if they are related to language, we expect them to be on the left. And possibly, the asymmetry we see here might be related to language processes. Yeah. I agree, yeah.
All right, thank you. So this might just be a clarificatory question, but did you say that about retroperception? Does global workspace theory predict that retroperception is possible, or that there will be, or that it will be associated with specific differences, which maybe I just didn't quite follow?
To me, these these theories, including the global workspace theories, I think they predict retroperception is possible. And indeed, we tested it. We wouldn't have bet that it could work if we didn't have this all theoretical reasons behind it.
Right. So what explains why retroperception seems to be only possible like shortly after you said we can detect traces of the perception, but why can't you just like retropercept stuff from 1 week ago? Why does that have to be right after?
I think the only limiting factor, but we have to still investigate that. But I think the only limiting factor is the presence of the trace, the sensory trace. And so I became interested in that physiologically as well. And unless you enter episodic memory, which is a very special process and I think is very central in conscious activity, unless you do that, apparently you can have rapid changes in synaptic weights in the sensory cortices, and I think that's what we're picking up with our protocol. But these seem to be short-lasting, especially when you have all the other stimuli coming up. And that's typical of masking. If we had masked all stimuli, we couldn't have retroperceived them.
Right. So you can't see, you can make sure that there's no memory involved in retroperception. You can see that memory is not involved.
So yeah, at some point, so I'm quite sure there's no memory in the sense of episodic memory, because otherwise people would say, yeah, I've seen it.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe a key point there is there's some sensory memory that's very short-lasting, but that's constantly overwritten. If new incoming information overrides that, so then you lose the previous content. Okay, so that's
yes, and one important phase of our piloting of these experiments was to attract attention without masking the stimulus, without adding another stimulus that would erase it.
Yeah. Okay. I will ask you more about the memory later, but maybe the question in between.
Yeah, I have a question about this, what happens at 250 milliseconds. Do you think it's just, because there seems to be like a gating there, do you think it's just a matter of a threshold reached by the sensory areas that then like recruit the higher order, or do you think there is some mechanism that is engaged, like neuromodulatory or whatever, that triggers the following activation?
Yes, so indeed it's a very interesting phenomenon, this gating. So first I would like to say that we know that it can have two components, either the stimulus strength or the attentional state. And here in the attentional blink, we can show that it's really the processing of the previous stimulus, variations in how efficient people were in processing the previous stimulus, that sometimes allow the second stimulus to be processed and conscious, and sometimes block it. So it seems to be, in the psychology literature, that's what you would call a bottleneck in information processing. There seems to be some form of seriality for these processes to occur. And now, neurally, what are the mechanisms that are behind this gating? We've tried to make some simulations of small models of the. I didn't have time to speak about that, but I could give you the references. So simulations of models of this phenomenon, and but it's very coarse, of course, but we saw that these bifurcation dynamics we could observe for networks where we had strong AMPA connectivity for the feed-forward, and NMDA feedback was very important to have these phenomena. So sometimes you just go feed-forward, and sometimes you maintain some stability across the network. That's thanks to AMPA. But yeah, that's what we have for the moment. But maybe you have a more specific hypothesis or not? Yeah, but yeah, so I could send you the references.
To the previous one, I think. What roles memory? What's the place of memory in this?
What's the role of memory in this?
Yes.
So that touches upon the question of the functions of consciousness, I guess.
Yes, recognition.
Yeah. Sorry?
Recognition.
Recognition? Yeah. So So I think, but it's not something. So it's not something that we've published yet. But I do think that in this process where you allow the information to be processed much more flexibly. That's the central idea of the global workspace. I think there is one very powerful mechanism that is triggered, and that's episodic memory. Because once you encode a stimulus into episodic memory, it's there for a very long time. It's going to replay, and it's going to be flexible even when you're not thinking about it. It's going to change. So I think my intuition is that one central function that we didn't highlight so far that much in the global workspace, one very central function that is allowed by this global workspace episode is encoding the stimulus into episodic memory. And that will have you, allow you to go back to it flexibly and cross time. So yeah, so I think it's really central. Episodic memory is really central, but it's not something that we've highlighted so far in the global workspace, I would say.
Thank you.
Maybe I could ask you, since I talk about memory, I'll get back to you, also Bjørnar, later. Because working memory is very closely related to ignition, right? So that's very much the same thing. But and then you have the episodic or the long-term memory after that. But before the work memory, you have the sensory memory with high capacity. That's all the time overwritten.
Yes.
But you know, according to Victor Lamme, that corresponds to an early form of consciousness, that phenomenal consciousness that is not, that only lasts only a fraction of the memory trace lasts only a fraction of a second, and therefore it's very hard to study and report, etc. But what's your view on that? Because you call that preconscious and not phenomenal consciousness, right?
Yes.
So what's your view on that?
Okay, to me, I do think that the processes that are highlighted in recurrent processing make a strong difference. I mean, they do construct the percept, and that's also why they are highlighted. They relate to the moment where the representations are in phase with how things appear to us, and less close to to the basic stimulus.
Yeah. Mm.
So that's true. But in the end, you could say it's just a matter of definition. You define, okay, so you define this as pre-conscious, but I think it's a bit more than just a matter of definition, because if you argue that something is related to consciousness, even when people deny having seen the stimulus, and there are experiments, for example, in the attentional blink experiment here, in the not seen condition, we have late activation in the temporal cortex, and people deny having seen the stimulus. Then recurrent processing proponents would say, well, people, they are wrong. They actually have seen the stimulus. I think it's problematic to say that we're doing a science of consciousness and going against the core intuition behind the term. So we're not using the term at all.
I see what you mean. So it's a tricky question, but also split brain patients, of course, you can't trust them because, in a sense, right? But,
yes, but you could find ways to test them. But it appears to me that if you say, okay, I have a measure of consciousness in which I admit that it can be present, but people deny having seen it. Unless you can find other ways to prove me that you've seen it, then you're speaking of something else. But but I see how it's related to consciousness. I see that the representations that are made up by these recurrent processing are the representations that the way they appear and not the way they enter.
Okay, okay, so okay, we can go back to that. But you have something more, Bjørnar. Would you like to say that now, or I'll just say that in the meantime, that I think it's perfectly natural that you deny having seen it if you have forgotten it immediately.
Yeah, but then it's
Okay. Anyway, Bjørnar, want to add something?
So I have two questions, but going back to your slide that we didn't find, and the difference between having perceived and not having perceived, and the difference being clearest in the prefrontal cortex. You said the motor cortex, but it seemed to be premotor actually. Now,
okay, so I think I know which slide you speaking about. Sorry, so it's the brains of the active and passive and the difference.
Yeah, so you had 3 images of brains.
Yes, it's this one.
I think we're on our way.
It's this one.
There you are. So, to me that seems to be close, or maybe be the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, or maybe a bit posterior to that, and also involving the frontal eye field. And yes, which is an area which is hypofunctioning in people with attention deficit, ADHD.
Okay.
And so when you pinpoint that people who do not perceive the sensory information do not activate this area.
It's not exactly this, but yeah.
Yeah, well, it sheds a very interesting light on the situation of people with ADHD, possibly.
Okay.
Namely, that they haven't perceived what they were supposed to perceive. For instance, in a classroom situation or in social cues around them, etc.
Okay. So, but which area? So, superior frontal gyrus here?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, and so there is an hypofunction of this area in ADHD?
Yes,
Okay, I didn't
which
know.
improves with centrally stimulating medication,
Okay,
methylphenidate
Okay.
or amphetamine. Now, so that was a comment, really,
Yeah.
which made your talk even more interesting. The other thing is, my question is, the system that you're describing, can you envisage that being fatigued? Can it be tired out?
yes, obviously. We can feel it.
Have you tried that? And do you see when it tires?
So I don't know if that would answer your question, but we're starting studies where we're going to study these kind of processes during when people get asleep, actually. And I have other colleagues that actually actively tire people. So you might be interested, so that's not something I've done, but that's a very intriguing line of research that is done by a colleague called Thomas Andrion in Paris, where they do tire people with like very demanding tasks. And they see that they claim that they see that the prefrontal cortex, but only this gets a little bit to sleep, like micro sleeps, but local sleeps to rejuvenate during the processing. That would obviously affect the whole network that I'm talking about. So, but yeah.
Thanks.
Any more? Oh, you have a question? Yeah.
From the internet.
Okay, good.
There was a person asking if you could elaborate a little bit on the relation between a gradual increase in how the gradual increase in stimulus strength might be related to some sort of gradual differences in the perceived phenomenon, so to speak. So if you increase so you were talking about thresholds at some point, right? And if you could elaborate a little bit.
Yes. So indeed, I've mostly focused on the jump between two types of processes. But what's also very interesting in these studies, both behaviorally and in neural activity, is that we do see some modulation of the strength of the high level with the stimulus strength, and we see that here. So it's fatigued as well. Yeah, not so much on this one, a little bit. But okay, here I mostly highlight the two bumps, but even when we have stimulations that are above threshold, the mean of the stimulation increases with stimulation strength. So this, if we believe in the workspace or playground proposition, the intensity of how this network is activated might relate to the strength of the stimulus. So there is still some gradual increase, but with an embedded jump between two types of processes.
Yeah. Hedda has some more question. Yeah.
I had a follow-up based on what you said to Johan about you have to kind of trust how people describe their experience or whether they have an experience. So if you have a case of retroperception and you ask somebody like how they feel, wouldn't people typically say not that they didn't have the experience at all at first and the whole experience kind of happened when you had a double take? They would rather say, okay, I noticed that I actually experienced it. So would you say that that is some evidence that in retroperception there is maybe a phenomenal experience, sort of like a little bit associated with, what was it, the local recurrence or whatever was going on at first?
Yes. So would you say, so is your question related to how people actually perceive the timing of the...
Yeah, or how it feels to have the perception. Wouldn't people often report, or at least from my own case, that it's a case where you're often not sure how to describe what is happening, from the inside, but it kind of feels like you notice that you notice a previous experience. It's not that you trigger an experience by the cue, or at least that might be how a lot of people would report things. So would you say that is, they're being confused if they say that, or that maybe people actually don't say that, or yeah?
Well, okay, so I'm sure we could, that would be interesting to go a bit deeper into what people actually experience, because indeed we just ask them to rate how well they've seen the stimulus. But what's very striking is that the number of trials where people say, I haven't seen anything, is changed by the stimulus that comes afterwards. So I think that argues very strongly towards the idea that there was something that was just not there in the experience that we managed to rescue. But indeed, that would be interesting to go deeper into the phenomenology of the experience of what you experience when you have that.
Did you try the experience yourself, the experiment? So, did you?
So many times.
Yeah. So, what did it feel like when you got the cue afterwards? Did it feel like you experienced the grating, or did it feel like you remembered?
It's really difficult to say. It's really, that's, yeah. Back to the days of introspectionism,
well,
I would have been terrible because, and that was also what convinced me, was that I could give myself feedback, which I didn't do for subjects, but I could give myself feedback sometimes that the cue was after the stimulus, and I was surprised. So, so at least on some trials, it doesn't mean that on all trials it's the case, but at least on some trials, the experience was as if the cue came first, and then
okay.
Yeah. But this we can actually test with experiments, and we are trying to do that. It's possible that it's intermingled, and also what's very interesting with our cognition is that we don't only say what we have in our mind; we reconstruct things based on what's plausible. So I think there must be some processes like that also going on in these experiments. But yeah, I was just like as naive as my first subjects, although I knew the structure of the experiment.
Okay, I think we are a little bit over time, but it's great that you could continue so for long. But if there are no more urgent questions, maybe we should let people back out in the sun. And
Yes, yes.
It was great having you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.